They will tell you salt is simple, white as bone, harmless as snow. But in the lordship of Montreval, in the year of our Lord 1342, salt had a chain around its throat and a sigil pressed into its skin. The Loire ran wide and brown below the limestone ridge, mists skirting the vineyards and the old Roman road. On that road stood the toll gate, 2 posts of oak shod with iron, and the bar between them was a beam as thick as a man's thigh. From that beam hung a chain, black with tar, and from the chain hung a seal of wax the size of a child's palm. It was stamped with the crowned helm of Seigneur Hughes, and it glinted crimson whenever a slit of sun found it through the smoke of the charcoal braziers. Behind the gate, under an awning stitched from burlap and sailcloth, served the salt-keeper's table. It was an altar of authority, iron scales balanced over a slate pan, a rod etched with notches for legal measure, a flask of brine to test purity, a knife to shave slivers from suspect blocks, and the ledger, pigskin-bound, heavy sullen, waiting for names that trembled as they were spoken. Beside it, a tithe chest rested in the damp, with its 3 locks and 3 keys. The church claimed its share of salt, not because Christ had asked for it, but because fast days multiplied fish, and fish without salt rots into sin. Every Friday, every Ember Day, every vigil, the bell of St. Martin tolled and reminded the poor that holiness and hunger were neighbors. Montreval's law was not written in Latin on parchment alone. It was written in the ache of shoulders and the emptiness of barrels. Seigneur Hughes had purchased the king's license to monopolize salt within a day's walk of his seat. All salt entering his land had to wear his seal, bought dear from his greniers, his salt lofts, where the white stacks stood under thatch and rats skittered like shadows of guilt. If you brought salt from the coast, it was contraband until branded. If you dug brine from a marsh or scraped pans with your own hands, you were a thief of the seigneur's right. A peasant might call a pig his own, but the salting of the pig belonged to Hughes. By the gate, the wind carried smells like a litany, wet stone and horse sweat, old fish gut in the ditch, the sweet rank musk of spilled wine from a tightened cask, the sour waft of tanneries downriver, and the constant sting of smoke. The salt-keeper, Bertrand of the Scales, had a nose that never forgot. He wore a leather sleeveless coat that shone with grease and salt dust. His beard held the memory of a dozen stews. His eyes were small and patient. "Next," he said, as a carter coaxed his mule forward. The carter was a thin man with chapped lips and a red cloth tied at his throat to pretend warmth. His wagon wheels were dark with the night frost that still clung to the oak. 2 barrels stood lashed tight, their hoops rust-stained, their bungholes sealed with pitch. On each, a smear of red wax, thumb-stamped with a crude device, a star above a wave. The mark of a coastal salt pan guild from the estuary beyond the seigneur's lands. Bertrand lifted the knife. "You know that is no mark of Montreval." The carter's eyes flicked towards the tower of the toll house, where a hole like a wink showed the dungeon's grate. From within drifted a cool breath that might have been merely night air, or the patience of punishment. Above, the tower bell nodded slightly, its rope tied off, as if already knowing it would be rung again before dusk. "I know my hunger," the carter said, "and my neighbors. The price at your grenier has climbed like ivy. We bought where the sea sells to all winds." Bertrand smiled, a tightness more than warmth. "The sea sells to waves. Montreval sells to souls. Unlash." It took 2 men to roll 1 barrel near the scales. The iron hook, cold biting, snared the hoop and scraped. The barrel came to rest with a thunk that echoed in the salt-keeper's table. Bertrand shaved a curl from the head's edge. He set it upon his tongue, like a priest sets bread upon a believer's. He closed his eyes. He spat into the brine flask, stirred, watched. He weighed. He nodded at his clerk, a boy with chapped knuckles and a quill worn down like a chewed reed. Purity passes, Bertrand said. But the seal does not. To pass the gate, you take Montreval's mark and Montreval's tax. If you refuse, the road back is long and full of questions. How much? The carter asked, though he knew. 6 deniers the sack. 12 the barrel. The carter swallowed. The village has no coin left. The winter ate it all. We barter with needles and with hours of our backs. Your mule has a fine harness, Bertrand observed. Linen in the padding. You can strip it and still live. At the edge of the crowd, wives with shawls pulled tight against the damp, old men like roots, a boy with a lice comb tucked into his belt, as if to boast that at least this plague of tiny thieves might be kept at bay. Someone muttered, "Would you have us salt our children with tears?" Laughter, bitter, brief, died because the wardens stood with their clubs and their iron caps. Their mouths were red as if from wine, but it was only the reflection of the seal hanging from the gate, quivering crimson when a breeze worried it. In Montreval, the salt law reached everywhere. In the market square, a sign, ink run by rain, declared it a market offense to sell meat unsalted on the second day. Bakers were warned to keep bread within the customary pinch, neither generous, which cheated the seigneur of his markup, nor stingy, which cheated the stomach. In the fishmonger's stall were hooks for eels, but behind them hung a strip of parchment with the fines for false salting, too little too late, or a public washing of fish within the fountain's basin. The fountain was a bowl of cracked stone with a face spitting water green and slow. Once a week, the beadles of St. Martin scrubbed it with vinegar and sand, muttering over it like men who knew prayer was the last cloth left when law failed. Bertrand's knife paused. 6 deniers the sack. 12 the barrel, he repeated, and his clerk began to write the carter into the ledger, letter by letter, as if dragging him by the wrist. A woman stepped forward, ribs like ladder rungs, cheeks hollowed by softened turnips. She carried a wooden bucket with iron bands. It had the look of a thing used for everything: water, wash, waste. The rim was smooth where hands had hoped upon it. She set it near the barrel and did not look at Bertrand when she spoke. "Let me buy a ladle's worth. I will pay with labor. See me on bridge duty. I will haul stone." Her eyes flicked to the tally rod, where corvée hours were cut with a knife and counted. The winter had chewed the Lord's bridge at the ford. The seigneur's men conscripted bodies to replace timbers slicked with ice. Those who refused the work sat in the stocks by the market cross, and boys threw cabbage leaves or the occasional clod that smelled worse. Bertrand did not answer the woman. It was not permitted to sell salt like soup. The law made a flock of buyers, not a cloud of beggars. He gestured at the chain across the road. The iron links like vertebrae. The beam stays down until the barrels are marked. Then he glanced up to the toll house window, where a shadow moved, not a face, just the certainty of a watcher. The carter's mouth opened, shut. His hand went to the red cloth at his throat. He untied it. The wind took it and slapped it against the barrel like a warning. Single line of crimson on a world of bone and iron. "Take the mark," the clerk offered, the only mercy his age allowed. "It is the way things are." "Are they, you who listen from your chair, so far from this wet road, so warm? Would you pay the Lord to preserve what your hands already earned? Would you wear his seal simply to keep a winter's meat from dying twice?" The carter bowed his head. Bertrand reached for the seal press. It was an iron die, with the crowned helm carved into its face. He warmed wax near the brazier, the smoke tasting of resin and churned tallow. He pressed. The wax sank, flowed, held. The seigneur's mark bloomed upon the coastal smear. A new naming over an old ownership. The clerk blew gently until the blood red cooled to dull brick. A boy by the ditch counted the strokes of the press, as if they were bells for the dead. The chain lifted. The beam rose with a creak that sounded like a man coaxed to stand after a beating. The wagon wheels ground damp grit. The woman with the bucket watched the salt roll away, her mouth a thin line between refusal and begging. The carter did not meet her eyes. He passed beneath the gate, and the shadow watching from the toll house turned and left the window. In St. Martin's porch, the parish beadles were busy with their own small tyrannies. Grain was measured for tithe, scoop by scoop into the chest that creaked like a sick man. The beadles wore black hoods glossy with rain. They smelled of incense and damp wool, and the sour that comes from fingers that handle too many coins. Between measures, they checked heads. Lice laid eggs as surely as hens, and public shame was a cure as much as vinegar. A mother cried out when the iron comb scraped near her little girl's ear and drew a thin line of blood, no more than a scratch, but the child's face crumpled and the beadle's eyes flickered for a heartbeat with something almost like pity. "Cleanliness pleases God," he said, "because that is what beadles say to make this day like any other. Cleanliness also pleases law. If a man's house was caught washing fish in the parish fountain, he paid a fine that could eat a week. If a woman set out cloth to dry on the bench by the market cross, she could be whipped with words and threatened with the stocks, where splinters learned the names of the poor. If a butcher salted too late, and the meat turned sweet in the wrong way, he stood in the square wearing the false cut around his neck. A strip of bad flesh hung like a scapular while the wardens announced the offense. That morning, the wardens marched a cooper to the stocks. His crime: chipping the hoops of marked barrels so wax seals could be peeled and reapplied. A cleverness too clever to live. His hands shook as the wood closed over his wrists. The market paused, not out of compassion, but because humiliation always commands its own weather. A few threw words. One old woman, careful of her ankles on the wet stone, pressed a crust of bread into his mouth when the wardens blinked. The bell in the toll tower shuddered once, as if to say, "Order holds." Signor Hughes seldom came down from his keep. His castellani sat upon a hill spiked with hawthorn, an old love of war. But his seal flew everywhere: on the gate, on the barrels, on the parchment pinned to the door of the bathhouse, where a winter edict limited the hours of steam to the nobility and those serving them. Bathhouse. Yes, don't make the mistake of imagining they wallowed gladly in filth. Men love warmth and water. But hot water burns wood, wood costs coin, coin weighs heaviest in the Lord's purse, and so the poor paid in fines for steam that kissed a face too long. The rules hung on the nail beside the door: hours for lords and hours for the rest, a list of penalties. The veil of steam smelled of fennel when they could afford it, and of old sweat when they could not. "Tell me," the beadle had asked a child once, while combing his hair, "do you know why our Lord takes the salt?" "Because he is Lord," the child had said, which is an answer that is not wrong. Because he is Lord. Because the king, far away and near as bread, had given him the right to sell certainty in a white crystal. Because what preserves meat also preserves authority. Because every pinch speaks the language of dependency more clearly than sermons. Because a chain at a gate can be lifted for one and dropped for another. In the afternoon, clouds dragged low and silvered the Loire. A second wagon approached, canvas low over its cargo. The mule's ribs showed. The driver kept his cap down and his eyes on the road. When Bertrand waved him to stop, the driver pretended deafness, once, twice. A warden stepped, club out. The mule snorted. The driver soon heard. "What have you?" Bertrand asked. "Barrels of herring," the man said. "Saint days fill bellies. Lift the canvas." The man hesitated half a breath. It was enough to turn the air colder. The canvas went up. Barrels, yes. But their heads showed a different story. The hoops were new, the staves old. Wax leaked at the seam in a way that said hands had been busy by candlelight. There was no smell of fish fat, no breath of distant sea, only a dryness like a cupboard. Bertrand's knife made a clean triangle. He lifted the wedge. Salt spilled, fine and bright as snow melt. The crowd made the sound of a flock startled into flight, and yet rooted in place. Smugglers always think they can dress salt in fish's clothes. The law always thinks its nose can tell a disguise. "Who sold you these?" Bertrand asked. The driver stared at his hands, as if they had nothing to do with him. "A man at the wood's edge. I know no names." "Then, give me yours." He did, softly, as men do when they suspect their name will be made to kneel. The clerk wrote. The wardens put a hand to the driver's shoulder. "Gentleness, this first act, because the crowd was watching." People distribute their fear according to how hard the hand presses at first. Bertrand looked to the tower window. The shadow was back. Orders would come. Confiscation, a fine that sours into a debt, and debt turns a man into a tool, and tools repair the Lord's bridge until their handles snap. In the meantime, salt from the confiscated barrels would be scraped into the seniors' lofts and blessed with the proper mark, and the village would buy it as if it had never known them. A bell rang, not the toll house bell, but St. Martin's. One, then again, then the pattern that meant a council meeting at the porch. The beadles would tell of lice trends, of meat offenses, of the week's tithe. Someone would speak of the road. The beam of the toll gate had splintered 2 days prior, and the corvée must carry a new one up the hill. The council would nod. They would pray over a parchment declaring that all households with men between 16 and 60 must report at dawn with ropes and axes. Women too, if no men were there, because work does not leave for courtesy. The driver began his shame walk, not yet to the stocks, that would be decided tomorrow, but to the toll house chamber where suspects waited and listened to the scrape of mice and the slow drop of water that found a crack and made a sound like counting. The dungeon's grate ate light, and the straw on the floor felt like the winter's hair. Bertrand turned to the watching people. "Go to your tasks. Law is law. There will be salt at the Grenier tomorrow." A murmur moved, not quite obedience. In the back, the woman with the bucket stood tall. "At what price?" "At the price," Bertrand said, and the simplicity of his answer was as hard as the edge of his table. Night pressed close sooner than it should, as if the sky was also under orders. Smoke stooped low, making every eye water. At the bathhouse, the keeper hung a small lantern over the posted rules. The crimson wax on the paper had bled slightly in damp weather, making the seal look like it was still somehow alive. Men of the better sort went in, quiet, dry-footed, and steam drifted out with a faint sigh. Those who had no right to that warmth glanced and moved on fast, as if to slow was to commit an offense against the wind itself. In the cottages along the lane, stew simmered, thin as grudges. A mother put 1 pinch more salt into her pot than custom allowed. She looked toward the corner where a lice comb hung like a little iron man with cruel teeth, and said to the air, "God forgive me, the children must sleep." That 1 pinch might draw a beetle's nose tomorrow if the pot was left in the wrong place. That 1 pinch might keep a cough from turning to fever. The balance was a blade. On the ridge, in the keep, Seigneur Hughes dined by lamplight. His salt cellar was a tiny tower of carved bone. He pinched twice for his pork, and did not think it a sin. He is not a monster. He is a man who believes that order holds if certain small humiliations are administered daily like medicine. He does not seek cruelty for its flavor, he accepts it for its effect. He does not hear the carter's mule cough. He hears the scrape of the clerk's quill and finds in that music a reassurance. The ledger is filling, which means that law is known. Outside, the toll chain creaked when the wind shifted. Far down the slope, where the old Roman stones lay like teeth, boys hunted for spilled grains of salt with the tips of their fingers and licked them as if tasting the sea they might never see. A warden, bored, tried to play a tune on the tower bell with his palm, and hissed when the captain glared. The captain had a scar across his cheek like a line of red wax frozen into skin. Before the gate, under the awning, Bertrand closed the ledger. He wiped salt dust from his palm onto his leather and watched the last light die behind the vineyards. He is not a monster either. He is a man with a wife whose joints ache and a son who wants a wool hood too fine for their station. He will enforce the seal until the seal is the world. There is safety in this, there is pay. The dungeon grate breathes, the stocks are oiled against splinters, the tithe chest is locked. Would you bow the head to pass, traveler? Would you pay the price and tell yourself that tomorrow the taste of preservation is worth the taste of obedience? Or would you test the law and risk hearing the bell announce your name to the square? Night settles and makes all things simple. The chain lowers. The lamp burns low. In the dark, barrels look like sleeping children. In the dark, salt gleams faintly when a mouse burrows, and the grains slide and whisper like dry rain. And under the whisper comes the lowest sound of all, the law, working, patient as winter. Dawn came thin and metallic, a sky the color of old pewter. The bell at St. Martin called the corvée like a shepherd calls sheep, and men gathered at the ford with ropes over their shoulders, the river licking the timbers with a lazy mouth. Breath smoked. Mud took and returned boots with a sound like sighing. The carter was there, his barrels now stamped and paid for, rope bit into his palms as he helped lever the new beam. With each heave, his red cloth flicked like a tongue of warning at his throat. He said nothing, his payment held his tongue as surely as the stocks would have. When a plank slipped and clapped a man's shin, curses rose to the lip and stopped short of the warden's. Behind the line, the woman with the iron-banded bucket watched the river too, the rim of her bucket worn smooth by yesterday's refusal. At the toll gate, Bertrand unlocked the ledger. The page with the smuggler's name had dried with a bloom of reddish ink at the edge, as if the seal had bled there too. By mid-morning the driver was brought out, not to the dungeon grate. It would not be needed. The Lord preferred debt over darkness. The sentence was read on a square of parchment that snapped in the cold. Confiscation of barrels, a fine that no small man could pay in coin, and service at the bridge until the debt was satisfied to honor. The word honor ran straight and clean in the clerk's hand. They sat him in the stocks for 2 hours first, because shame is the introduction to all obediences. He bowed his head against the wood, his cap crushed by the curve. Someone spat. Someone prayed. A child stared with the unblinking cruelty that is only curiosity. When the wardens loosed him for the river work, he did not look back at the holes where his wrists had been. At the Grenier, the senior's loft, men hacked white blocks and pushed them down with shovels that squealed on wood. A corner barrel failed, only a hairline in a stave, but enough. A thin trickle began, then a thread, then a shining little stream that pattered onto the floor and sent a damp tongue toward the threshold. The keeper cursed and clapped a board to it, but salt has a will in thaw. It found the seam. The woman with the bucket happened to be near, called from the ford to fetch straw. She bent without thinking, without planning, the way a hand moves to warmth, and slid the bucket under the seep. A dozen eyes saw. A dozen mouths stopped. A warden's boot scraped. Bertrand's shadow fell across her, and the iron teeth of the law could be heard opening in the minds of those in the room. She lifted her gaze to him. Her lips were white as salt. Spillage, she said, in a voice that tried to be just a fact. Better caught than wasted. Bertrand's beard held the memory of a dozen stews. Perhaps this morning it remembered one thin as water. He looked at the trickle, at the swollen stave, at the woman's wrists where the skin was chapped until it shone. Then he took up the chalk and drew a mark upon the leaking barrel, a mark that meant loss entered in the ledger. Spillage, the Lord's misfortune, accounted as the Lord's strength. He did not kick the bucket. He did not call a beadle. He turned to the boy with the quill. "Record the weight of the barrel as of this moment," he said, and set men to new hoops. The boy bent, the feather squeaked, and the bucket filled grain by grain, no more than a handful when it stopped, a mercy measured like rain. The woman nodded, once, and slipped away as if carrying only water. Later, at her hearth, she would pinch that white into a pot where 2 carrots and a rind pretended to be a stew. She would set the lice comb by the bowl and tell the children, "Eat, then we wash," because holiness and hunger sit together, and she had learned to serve them in their order. At noon, sun bullied through the cloud and made the seal on the toll chain shine like a fresh wound. The beam heaved up into place over the ford as men cheered without smiling. Rope blisters swelled. A warden's club tapped rhythm on a boot heel. Smuggler set his shoulder without a word and learned the names of the timbers, the way men learn the names of tools that will own them for a season. St. Martin's porch smelt of vinegar. The beetles had boiled the combs. A petition was read, ink thick on vellum, asking that the Bathhouse grant 1 extra hour to the commons on market eves for the sake of cleanliness and peace. The seal of the Lord hung beside the clerk's hand like a red eye. "Denied," said the clerk, in the tone of a man announcing the weather. "Then let us pay," someone ventured. 1 farthing, a family. The beadle looked to the tithe chest, as if prayer could come out of it. The chest sat with its 3 locks, like a sermon on certainty. "The wood," he said, picking words like burrs, "costs more than your farthings. Keep your water cold." They dispersed, as people do when a hope is made small with a sentence. On the square, a butcher stood with a foul strip round his neck. His cheeks burned red as if they could cook his shame. The stocks, newly sanded, waited for the next set of wrists. A black-robed novice carried a bowl of ashes past, and the soot smudged his cuff. He did not notice, then did, and rubbed, and made the stain larger while trying to make it go away. Toward evening, the carter loosed the red cloth from his throat. He tied it on his daughter's wrist instead, a fool's bracelet, bright as a warning and bright as a hope. They rolled the marked barrels into a clay-floored room, where damp rose like a habitual thought. He lifted the lid and let the village see their purchase, not white as the sea, but white as the law. They measured carefully, rinds of wood used as scoops to keep hands honest, and the senior content. He kept aside the woman's bucket when she came, without words, without thanks demanded. He set it near her feet, and did not look at her face. In the keep, the Lord dined and spoke of hawks. He listened, with half an ear, to the seneschal's low recounting, the confiscation, the corvée hours, the loss by leakage, duly noted. He nodded once, as one nods at the news that rain has fallen on a field one does not intend to see. He slept well, which is a luxury purchased by others' choices. In the dark, the toll chain moved because the wind said so. Mice crackled in straw beneath the toll table. The dungeon grate breathed its cold. The tithe chest dreamed of harvest. The Bathhouse lantern fluttered, and the posted decree, hours for lords, hours for those who serve them, swayed and settled as if content. Somewhere a lice comb clicked on a nail like a cricket, patient, honest, tireless. What changed? Stave swelled and gave a widow the taste of the tide. A smuggler learned the arithmetic of debt and timber. A bridge rose and made the Lord's road whole. The law wrote itself 1 page thicker. A man with scales allowed himself one small theft of severity from the day. These are not moments that sing, and yet they are the song. Years from this winter, the beam will groan again, and other hands will lift it. The seal will weather and be recast. Children who licked salt from the ditch will grow to buy it and scold those who do not. A woman will die, and her bucket will hold ashes one last time before it is turned to carry stones. The lawyer will forget every name except lawyer. And you, listening from your warm chair, will remember the sound of the chain and ask yourself if the price of preservation was obedience, or if obedience was the only thing that could be preserved. What price would you have paid for a day without the chain? Tell me below. If this tale troubled your sleep, listen next to the market that fined the poor for washing, or the village that paid taxes for a king they never saw.